excuse my voice. I'm recovering from a sinus infection for which I refuse to take antibiotics. Careful of the tea, Mary. Careful of the tea. You're good. Okay. I'm Kara Cooney, Professor of Egyptian Art and Architecture and Chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and it is my pleasure to introduce Giorgio and Marilyn Buccellati. Giorgio was a professor in the NELC department for many years, and as you all know, he is still quite active teaching and excavating in Kurdish Syria at the site of Tel Mozan, the ancient city of Urkesh. A series of letters about the Hurrian city of Urkesh were found at the ancient Syrian site of Mari, a few hundred miles to the south. Mari was quite powerful in the 2nd millennium BCE and had taken Urkesh into its own territory, placing a vassal king there to rule on their behalf. One letter has the king of Mari writing to his Urkesh vassal king that, quote, "I did not know that the sons of your city hate you on my account, that you are mine, even if the city of Urkesh is not." Now, however, ancient Urkesh has a new king and queen, Giorgio and Marilyn Buccellati, and they serve the community. Indeed, they won the 2021 Balzan Prize for Art and Archaeology of the Ancient Near East for their achievements in the study of Hurrian culture and for highlighting its importance as the foundation of a great urban civilization, among the most flourishing in the ancient Near East in the 3rd millennium BCE, for promoting a digital approach to the study of archaeology, for enhancing theoretical reflection on the nature of this discipline. UCLA couldn't be more proud. Please help me to welcome Giorgio and Marilyn Buccellati.
Thank you, Kara. And I will start, and then Marilyn will come in halfway through. In this setting, I would like to just take a couple of minutes to remember in gratitude some super emeriti, because they are no longer with us. The chairs of the 2 departments that I was working with, the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. At that point, it was only Near Eastern Languages, and it changed to Near Eastern Cultures as well during my tenure, and history. And then the Institute of Archaeology. And in that regard, especially I'd like to remember Franklin Murphy, who was very personally involved and interested in getting it going. David Saxon, who was the provost at the time, and he was the one responsible for getting the institute starting with a budget of $5,000 a year. The institute was a drawer in my desk for the first year or 2. And Sven, Chancellor Svensson, who was also very much interested and involved. So it's beautiful to have this opportunity to remember them in a special way. What Franklin Murphy and Saxon and Sven made possible was the beginning of the Institute and a whole series of activities with it, including our excavations. Franklin was involved in the Kress Foundation, and then he was the president, I think, of the Kress Foundation, so we had the grants. The first grants we had for excavations were from Kress. And so the activities that we are talking about now are rooted in that ancient, recent past. But the past we are going to talk about, the one to which Kara referred, is much earlier. So we go back to really about 5,000 years ago. In fact, 6,000. Because as we will show you, Urkesh really is one of the first cities in history. Mozan is the name of the modern village next to the Tell, which you see here in the beyond the fields and with the backdrop of the Turkish Taurus Mountains. And it was just a hill when we got there in '84. It became Urkesh as a result of the excavation. So it's a beautiful way of seeing how archaeology can bring things to life. And we know we had assumed that it was Urkesh because of a series of some evidence that was already available, but we were able to prove it after 10 years of excavation with a series of written documents, of which this is one in cuneiform. It is on the border with Turkey, right on the border. The mountains that you just saw are in Turkey, so we're 5 kilometers from the border, which makes it rather risky at the moment because of all the political situation that you are familiar with. But it is also very much part of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek term. The Mesopotamians would never have called themselves Mesopotamians because the area between the rivers is really the least desirable. It's the one where the irrigation cannot reach from the river. So the real term was the land of the 4 river banks, the 2 rivers, the 2 banks of the Tigris and the 2 of the Euphrates. Urkesh is at the very extreme north of this, and it is, however, so only in part Mesopotamian, and that's one of the things that we will refer to. Today, the area corresponds to the 2 countries of Syria and Iraq, which we all know for reasons that are often very sad. And if anything, I think our talk will present an uplifting view of the situation there. And to give you a sense of scale, California is pretty much the same size as Syria, Mesopotamia. These are the arrow points to the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, just on the other side of the river, as we saw a moment ago. The climate is really not that of southern Mesopotamia. It snows in the winter. There is a lot of rain in the fall. And as a result, the area of Urkesh is that of sufficient rainfall for agriculture. So even though it does not need irrigation water from the rivers, there is enough rainfall for it. And that's in contrast with the steppe area, which you all know because of Palmyra. Palmyra is really in the center of this orange oval. It's semi-arid, meaning that there is some vegetation, but minimal, not enough for agriculture, just enough for the sheep and goats, essentially, to browse on. And it's non-irrigable because it's too far from, not only is it far from the Euphrates, which is the only river there, but also the Euphrates has cut a deep trough in the soil, and so the one cannot raise the water to the steppe area. And it's even more different from the arid and irrigable area of the south, where the Sumerians in particular started the urban civilization around 4000 BC. At its prime, really the one that we know best at the moment, Urkesh is from the 3rd millennium. It has the arrow points to the central part, which is the hill that you saw and that you see in the little inset. That's just the high mount. The rest of the map of the plan shows the outer city. And to give you an idea of the size again, it matches pretty much UCLA campus, which in turn matches that of any of most European medieval cities. So it's very large. It's about 130, 140 hectares, so some 300 acres. Always the outer city, which is very, very large for an ancient city. Now, we excavated there for 25 years. We will still be excavating now. We're not for the war, and we're doing something else, which is what Bernie will show you. The major findings are the 3, and I will point them out to you. This is to give you a sense of what significance Urkesh has historically, and why it has become, this will be the second part that Mary will talk about, why it has become a source of pride for the local people. Essentially, what I'm showing to you now is what we have been trying to, and succeeded, in communicating to the local people who were totally unaware, just like everyone else, in fact. Urkesh was completely unknown until the excavations. But in this case, it has become a source of pride and therefore of life. So we'll start with the temple. The temple has a big temple mound, and it is at the very top. We call it a VA. There is a glacis that goes up to it, and the monumental access, which is the one that you saw a moment ago. It has a very asymmetrical organization of space. The temple is at the top of this shape, which is like a temenos, the area that encloses the sacred area. And the part that's dotted is the one that has not been excavated yet. There is a revetment wall that encloses this area, the sacred area, and the staircase that you just saw. Two bronze lions were found in the 50s, before our excavations, which started in 1984. So in the 50s, these two lions were sold on the antiquities market. They came from some excavations in the area. It was not known exactly where, but they're written, as you see, both of them. The one on the left is now at the Met in New York, and the one on the right at the Louvre in Paris. The text says that it is the foundation deposit of a temple in Urkesh. For a number of reasons that I won't go into now, we assumed that it was Balzan. That used to, as I said, they were found in the general area, but the general area, so there was no indication exactly where they were excavated. But we assumed that Balzan was Urkesh, and that's why we started excavating in 84. And it took, as I said, 10 years then to find proof like the little red inscription you saw a moment ago, where the name Urkesh appears, and several others, in fact. Second major architectural monument is the palace, which is, now the temple was in use from the very beginning. We'll see in a moment, it goes back to the 4th millennium. What we saw, the staircase we saw is from the 3rd millennium, so about 2,600. But it dates back to at least 3,500, very likely the beginning of the 4th millennium, so around 4,000. That's the temple. And it remained in use until the end of the city's history, which is about 1200 BC, when it was completely abandoned. The palace instead, as you see here, was only used for 2 generations, around 2300 BC. We have a number of seal impressions, which are very tiny, about the size of your fingernails, the larger, the thumb fingernail, but they're also inscribed. And so this is, for instance, the one of the king, and it says that he is the king of Urkesh, Turkish king of Urkesh, the word for king being in Hurrian. So that's something we'll talk about in a second, that is why, one particular reason for the importance of all of this is that it gives us evidence of a new type of cultural civilization, that of the Hurrians. We have excavated only a portion of the palace, which you see here, the walls covered to protect them. The rest of the palace goes under much higher levels, and will take a long time to excavate the full size of the palace. But even apart from the seal impressions with the inscriptions, which are the most important find, there are also other aspects, like the a very beautiful stone courtyard. The holes that you saw were wells dug in later times by people who did not, local people in the second millennium, who did not know that there was a palace there. This is a reconstruction, a 3D reconstruction of the excavated area. And one of the important finds from it's actually not from the palace, but from the same period, is this plaque in stone. The reason why it's important is because it depicts a scene of the most famous epic, perhaps of the ancient Near East, that of Gilgamesh. It's the episode where Gilgamesh, as a young boy or man on the right, becomes friend with the savage Enkidu on the left. And the rest of the plaque would have described the rest of the events. So this is important because it shows the reception of the classical Mesopotamian literature and evidence in this city, which was, as you saw, on the margins of Mesopotamia proper. Third major monument, the necromantic shaft, called Abi in Hurrian. The word Abi we did not find in our text, but we could argue, in fact it was Merlin really who published the evidence for identifying this structure as a necromantic shaft, which is known to have been in use only by the Hurrians from later texts, and it's from there that we have this name, the word Abi. It is very deep, as you see, and it most likely goes down to the virgin soil, which is another 6 meters below the lower floor. The structure as we see it now dates from the same time as the palace, and that's why we show it next to the wall of the palace. It was used primarily by the king and the queen and the courtiers to ask for predictions about the future. And we know about it from a very interesting episode in the Bible. The first book of Samuel speaks of a certain woman who is called the Lady of the Ob, Hebrew rendering of the word Abi. Book of Samuel dates to around the 10th century or so BC. So long, over the millennium after this thing. But it shows the continuity of the, not only of the word, but of the, let's call them rituals, connected with the word. The walls were in stone, as you see them now. This kind of definition of the area of the well is probably an innovation of the third millennium. In other words, up until the first 1,000 years of use, it was probably an open-air pit, just like the circle that you see at the bottom here. But then, at some point, it was built into a structure, as you see it now, which is quite monumental, in fact, and impressive, and covered. It was roofed with a sort of cupola sort of thing. And with a very narrow entryway, narrow and steep, very steep. By the way, when we first found this thing, we thought it might be a well. That's the first thing you think of. No trace of water. Or maybe a burial, no human bones. And instead, what we found were several small circles inside the larger circle, shallow, with animal bones of a very special nature. They were mostly of puppy dogs and piglets. the kind of animals you don't normally find in the rest of the faunal remains, but which are instead attested specifically for the Abbey rituals in the later Hurrian texts. So that was what led Merlin to identify the structure as an abbey. So to going back to the nature of the entrance, steep and narrow, which also pointed to its not being likely to be used for a water, because if you go down to get water, you wouldn't want to have such a narrow and steep staircase to go through. But it was instead meant for the rituals, sort of evocated here by this slide with indicating that it was done at night, but even more dark because it was covered. And the reason for this later structure is that we assume that the queens, we know two queens who came to Urkesh from the south. They are Akkadian queens with Akkadian names. The Akkadians, just like the Sumerians, had in horror the idea of ghosts, of spirits of the netherworld wandering around the world unbidden. And so we assume that this structure was built to sort of give some sense of ease to the southerners who were coming up with a completely different cultural idea as to what the netherworld was. Now, just to finish, the most important finds are the seal impressions. I already mentioned it. I said they're very small. Here you get, you see one of them in the hand, and it's found in this very large excavation area. The reason for it, the reason I had this slide was to show you how the shading helps. It's not only the heat, because of course you saw the snow, but in the summer it's extremely hot. It's normally about 40 centigrade. So it's not only the heat, but also the glare of the sun that makes it impossible really to see anything when you excavate. And that's why this kind of cover made it possible instead for us to pick out pieces of consolidated clay that look like potential ceilings. We had about 10,000 of them. And of them, about 1,000 turned out to be ceilings. And again, this is Merlin's main work. So they were all not only identified but labeled in the field just to keep a track of their stratigraphic origin, and then studied. So, see, the point is that they're all broken. Here you see a little piece which matches the right hand of the drawing, but it goes with the other one. It's not like a puzzle where the pieces go together, because these are different ceilings that were rolled on clay. The seal was rolled on clay at different times, and then they were broken when either the container or the door was open. And so, and the pieces were simply scattered on the floor where we found them. So it was not possible for Merlin to just join them. They had to find, she had to find overlaps of details of the iconography to put them together. And with this, she came up with about 200 out of the 1,000, because there are many that belongs to the same original ceilings for the original seal. So there are about 200 actual seals that could be reconstructed, which are very rich of information and complex. This is, for instance, the one of the royal family. With Turkish, his head is missing at this point. We actually found it later. So we have the complete seal. Here's with his family. The queen In fact, this is actually not the seal of the king, but the seal of the queen, who says simply, gives her name in the writing on the right. It says Uknitu, the wife of Turkish. That's all it says. And it's a queen with the crown prince, you see, already has a crown on his head, touching the knee of the father. These instead are from, these are also from Uknitu, with just her daughter and the queen who, the attendant who takes care of the child. It's in this case, the inscription only says Uknitum, wife. It doesn't say of Turkish, because she's the first wife and the most important one. Then we have them from, it's a similar scene, but in this case it's a scene instead of the wet nurse, the one up above, and the one below of the chief cook. It just says cook, the seal, but it doesn't mean that she was cooking. It means that she was in charge of the banquets of the royal palace. This is another queen. The inscription is longer, and in this case, instead of saying that she's the wife of someone, she said that she's the daughter of Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin being the king of Akkad, who had conquered really all of Syro-Mesopotamia, in effect. So it was like the Napoleon of the time, let's say. So she puts in her seal that she's the daughter of Naram-Sin. What is interesting is that Naram-Sin conquered, which actually his grandfather already had conquered. He consolidated the empire, but never ventured against Urkesh or Elam, which is southern Iran today. Very wisely. Instead, he entered into dynastic marriages with them, giving his daughter, as we just saw, to the king of Urkesh, and the same thing with Elam, which was a very, smart thing to do, because he anticipated the difficulty of warfare in the mountains, and instead of doing that, Urkesh is in the plain, but as you saw, it's really the hinterland of the mountains, the kingdom of Urkesh. And so instead of getting involved in guerrilla warfare, he married somebody. So you wish some of our presidents would do the same with all the guerrilla warfare that we keep losing around the world. So a word about the Hurrians before I turned it over to Marilyn. The document that was known, the only document known from the 3rd millennium before our excavations was this, the lion from the Louvre with the inscription on a stone tablet, which we said would come, I told you, we assume comes from our temple. We're quite sure that it comes from our temple. We know pretty much where it had been found. This was from the 3rd millennium. The only text of the 3rd millennium known before excavations. Otherwise, Hurrian was known from much later, from about 1400, primarily BC, from the archives in the Hittite capital. The Hittites regarded the Hurrians a bit like the Romans, the Greeks, and so it was a sacred language, even though the Hurrians had become very less important. Now, this is then a royal inscription, and I'll just show you some of the other texts that we now found. The seal inscriptions, in this case, yet another king, who says that he is the Endan, the Hurrian word for king of Urkesh. An administrative text, which is very important, because it means that the language of Hurrian had trickled down into the bureaucracy. Or not trickled down, it had been imposed, in fact, on the bureaucracy. So they used the same Tuyi from a Sumerian, and then Akkadian, but it's written in Hurrian. So, which means really that the city was essentially Hurrian. It wasn't just the sort of ceremonial inscriptions like the stone tablet or the seal impressions. It was really the common language. We don't have any letters yet, but this is very significant. Then another seal. The reason I show you this one is because in addition to the language, what is also very distinctive is the realism of the style, which is in contrast with the Sumerian style from the south. Here you see the crown prince in a position similar to the one we saw before. His feet are really kind of inside the mane of the lion, who is, so the lion is alive, is depicted as being a live animal, not a statue, drinking from a cup into which something is poured. And the jaws are open not because he's angry, but because he's well sated. And so this kind of realism is really in contrast with the Sumerian, much more stereotyped. And this is one of the crown prince. It's a seal of the crown prince. That's what the inscription says. And then especially the lion from the Met, which has this very dynamic gesture where it gives you the sense of movement. Again, something very un-Sumerian. So you see how then we are Mesopotamian and not. There is really something very new that is injected. Then, of course, the Abi, which has the religious significance that I mentioned before. It's purely a Hurrian thing, in contrast very much with the sensitivity and effect of the Southerners. The great asymmetry in the architectural setup, like that of the temple, where unlike the ziggurats from the south, which are really extremely symmetrical, this really is not. So we really have a contrast between the Hurrians and the Sumerians in the third millennium. And one other aspect, one way in which we can sort of explain this is also if we look at the political structure of the kingdom. In the south, they were essentially small territories. Every city had a small area under its control with smaller towns or villages. The same is true of Urkesh in the plain area, but in addition, Urkesh controls very much the valleys in the north. And that's what Naram Sin understood he could not easily do. And that's why he left the, he chose an alliance instead of warfare. One interesting thing is a text known from the later Hurrian text. I mean, the text is early, but it's known from later tablets in the Hittite capital, where this is kind of a summary of the initial part of the text. Silver is a divine child living in the mountains, and he has a dispute with other children. So they're playing and they have a rough time. So the mother tells him, and this is now the actual text, Kumarbi resides in Urkesh. He resolves the lawsuits of all the lands. So, Silver, since you have problems with your companions, set out for Urkesh. And he did. She tells him to set out. He does. He arrived in Urkesh, but did not find Kumarbi in his house, because Kumarbi had gone to roam the land. He wanders about up in the mountains. See, it's a perfect mythical rendering of the situation that we were just seeing a moment ago, that is the city controlling the hinterland in the mountains. Finally, I said I would turn it over to Marilyn, but I'll have one more word, is really the early period, we saw how we go back to, this is what I want to show you. So the very last season of excavation, which was 2010, the war started in 2011, and we didn't go back. We found this thing, I call it the sleeping giant. It's in red. It's the corner of a structure of a building, which is dated very clearly by the ceramics and carbon-14 of bones found next to it, to the middle of the 4th millennium, 3500 BC. It's immediately below the glacis of the 3rd millennium temple, and very high, about 23 meters above the plain level. So it means that the middle of the 4th millennium, 3500, there was already a monumental structure, most likely an early version of the temple, so high, built so high in the, so therefore there was a city that supported it already in the 4th millennium. This is the likely building which is known from other sites. The corner is, so in other words, instead of a temple. And the assumption then is that the red outline indicates the presumption that there was already a city in the 4th millennium below this temple. And that's the outline that we presume is there. It's in very good shape, the corner. So it's very likely that we would find the whole thing. We never had so much desire of going back to excavate as in 2010, but we didn't. We couldn't because in 2011, March, the war started. And so we have to wait until we can go back. But in the meantime,
the start of the conflict in 2011 brought a sudden halt, as you can imagine, to our excavations. But it was by no means the end of our presence at the site. So, well, the pictures that Giorgio has shown you all occurred, the excavations and the study of the results before 2011. All the ones that I'm going to show you are, for now, from the last 12 years. And you'll see a much more hopeful Syria than the one you are accustomed to from the news. We decided to continue our progress, our work around the site, basing it on our relationship to the local people, so to our workmen, but also to people in the local villages. So even during the war, we decided to continue our activities there, even if we could not be there ourselves, but from a distance, we continued this work. What community archaeology means, in effect, is that the past is not a thing. It is a process whereby the past becomes heritage, and in turn, heritage is truly such when, actually, there are inheritors who understand this heritage. As archaeologists, we are called to be the Socratic midwives who help the local communities, and especially the younger ones, to recognize themselves as inheriting a broken tradition. That is, we are called as archaeologists to mend the brokenness. It all begins with conservation. Now, Giorgio showed you about the weather. Mud brick, the walls of the palace the temple are made out of mud brick. And once exposed by excavations, they are extremely fragile. And here you can see the palace covered on the right is, the palace covered with snow. And here it is in the summer where we constructed localized shelters with iron trellises that follow the contours of the walls. And then the walls are covered with burlap, which helped us immensely during the war, because of course you couldn't get materials from outside, but you could get burlap because agriculture activities still continued even during the war. So it was easy to repair these burlap covers. Once preserved, we can help make sense of the site for visitors, not only distinguished visitors like Martin Sheen, but also, in the first place, our own local workmen. They are the first inheritors to whom we explain what we were finding, and sometimes we were able to not only explain what we were excavating, but also to give quite complicated technical details, which they definitely understood. Even if my Arabic wasn't quite up to sometimes the technical details, they would shout out from the audience, the word that they thought was appropriate, and many times helped me out. We set in place an extensive signage system. Some signs offering a panoramic view, in this case, the view of the palace, and some giving a detailed explanation of a specific feature. And these are only simple printed pages. And these allowed the maintenance to be easy for the local people to maintain. We also organized, this is always after the war started, but this is the one at the cusp of the war. We organized a series of exhibits, and here is I'm only going to talk about the ones we organized in Syria. This one in Damascus is particularly meaningful because it was commissioned by the U.S. Embassy in Damascus. And it opened in the National Museum on the 1st of March, 2011. And this is an entry from the U.S. Embassy website. And this is an entry from the Syrian news website. Amazingly, hostilities began 3 days after the closing of this exhibit. So it's the last time that you can see the two flags seen side by side. The following year, the local community, on their own initiative, opened a small museum next to the site. This is the simplest of all the exhibits, but one we are so proud of because local people organized it for themselves. Then exhibits in Kamishli and Amuda, the two cities, Syrian cities closest to our site. Here you see various people. And in Beirut, at the AUB, again in Kamishli, and finally in Aleppo. To reach a more capillary audience, we initiated a program for villages in the area around the site, with private lectures in homes, that you see here, and also in local schools. The audiences were always rapt attention for these local lectures. We organized a women's atelier where they produced jewelry that you can see hanging there, and clothes, and some lovely dolls. Your grandchildren would probably like to see these dolls. It turned out to be extremely useful for these local women because they were making clothing, and especially clothing for small children, which were not available because of the war in the local markets. So they had a market, a local market, for what they were making. Before the war, we had this ambitious plans for an eco-archaeological park, some 54 square kilometers in size, including 22 villages with bed and breakfast accommodations. Each village would host an exhibit pairing ancient and modern life, and each devoted to a distinct aspect of animal husbandry, you can see here, agriculture, or ceramics. This was in 2010, and the park plans, of course, had to halt. The most recent and perhaps most ambitious goal has been the school project, on which I would like to dwell on it for a little bit longer here. We started early on to organize bus trips to the site for youngsters in middle and high schools of the area. At the site, they were introduced to the major monuments by our local staff archaeologists. And here you can see him talking. And even technical explanations. For instance, the man in the center with the cap on, he is talking about, he's one of our local workmen who was an expert, became an expert in ceramics, and so he's explaining to these local children about ceramics. And of course, the local visitors, they went through all of the monuments. Giorgio explained to you the palace. They loved the necromantic shaft, you can imagine. And they made full use of the signage system. So this is the one overlooking the palace, and you can see with such enthusiasm that they're looking at the signs. And they're not only looking at the large panoramic signs, they're looking at the detailed ones. Now, music was always indispensable for these students on their field trips, and which you could see here. And in fact, a fully organized youth orchestra began to use the site as a stage for wonderful performances. And of course, you can imagine the steps were a perfect place for performances, and it is possible that in antiquity, those steps were used for the same purpose. The older students produced posters, while the younger ones made careful notes, like you can see here. They would then write about their experiences. And here I'll show you a couple of these more touching descriptions. These monuments standing against the threats for thousands of years and will remain for years to come in all their glory and great history. This is a student in middle school. I look at it with so much pride because I know I have a great history that tells me who I am. Can you imagine the contribution that they're making? We went home proud of our ancestors' history is another one. And in some cases, they were also experiencing lessons in English because the all of these were supervised by online channels because of a link to the local schools. In the area of Urkesh, and the local schools were linked through our project with schools from places around the world. Here is a picture with the U.S., a school in the U.S. Which was connected to us. And of course, face to face, there were all kinds of chats. So these are various people who, this is a graduate student, Zichang Wang, who was mentoring the students in one of these encounters. Each group was asked to speak of their past. And you can tell from the pictures how delighted they were, the students in Syria, with talking about the past. And this is one from Greece, who was also connected to the schools in Greece at Corinth, connected to the schools. And there were schools in Italy also connected with the local Syrian schools. And in each case, there was just joy and enthusiasm you can see that on their faces. So happy to talk to their colleagues from a middle school or elementary school from around the world. Little wonder then that our work has been amply recognized with a number of awards. This one in 2006 by the World Monument Fund. 2011 by the Archaeological Institute of America. 2017, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The European Commission is called the Lucidare Award. Recently, last year, the European Association of Archaeologists. And most recently, the Balzan Prize for Art and Archaeology of the Ancient Near East. And here is our receiving the award at the Federal Building in Bern, Switzerland this past July. And we were presented with the award from the president of the Swiss Federal Council. But, oh, here we are again. Happy. Best of all these awards, was the awareness that we have been truly successful in our goals. Our goal to offer local communities the gift of their own inheritance. Now, look at the date, October 22nd, 2015. On this same day, the New York Times published this map. This is the moment of maximal territorial expansion of ISIS. And on that same day, our young people are laboring at the conservation of the staircase of the temple. Also because, plants would grow, it rains there, so plants would grow between the stones, animals would burrow between, so it has to have a constant upkeep. Or, look at this image of our young Syrians loading exhibit panels on a pickup truck. And, in contrast with the infamous ISIS pickup truck caravans. Or again, our people, young people, mounting an exhibit with the equally famous scenes of the destruction of the Mosul Museum by ISIS. But the image and sound I want to leave you with is that of a young girl playing the violin in an unforgettable set. She's a young girl from a city, a small city near the site, and part of that youth orchestra. Thank you.
It got to be a bit late, but we have a few more slides about the digital work. Any of you who needs to go, please go. And otherwise, we'll continue. There'll be another 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, good. So, I'll try and keep my watch in front of me. The Balzan Prize is primarily devoted to the digital work that we're doing. And I call it the digital turn because what we are proposing is not just a big database, which is what one mostly think of in terms of scholarly publishing. We're really instead trying to propose, and succeeding in fact, because we've already done it, a website approach to publishing, archaeological in this case, but in effect going beyond that. In effect, if you think about it, the standard website looks pretty much like a supermarket, where you have a top bar that it tells you what's underneath, right? And that's similar to what you have on a website, where, like the one of the Emeriti Center, where you have a top bar that gives you the content and then the individual pages. But there is really no argument that is developed in the website qua website. Websites are not epistemic systems. Epistemic system is something that constructs and conveys meaning, like information and meaning through arguments and through data, which is typical of a book or an article. This does not really happen with websites. If there is an argument that's developed, it's relegated to a PDF, which is not really integrated with the rest of the data. It's not, and that's one reason why also websites as such are essentially not considered as part of a, for career advancement, let's say, particularly for our younger people. The difference from a book like this one, my book on the theory of archaeology, is really one of perception. When you have a book in front of you, you immediately think of the content, you know what's in the book. You have the cover, you have the table of contents, you have a book, the content of a chapter, you have the index. And as a result, you really get immediately, physically, a sense of the whole, which you do not really have instead with a website, which are essentially constructed as containers. So the use of hyperlinks in standard websites is what we may call an informational or anecdotal hyperlink, where you go from one thing to the next. So, for instance, you open something about Urkesh, it takes you to the 4th millennium, then you find something that leads you to Sumer. Sumer in turn links you to prehistory. You go to Lower Paleolithic, but then you have forgotten why you started out on reading the first thing. Because it's not really a matter, it's structural. You see, the website is not an argument. When you read a book, you do the same thing. You jump back and forth. But you're always captured. One of our collaborators used this wonderful term, narrative gravity. The narrative has a gravity of its own that takes you back. If you're reading a narrative which has an argument that's constructed as such, you are led back to it. You're not distracted by in fact, what you read outside, it supports the central argument. So instead of an anecdotal or informational background, what we are proposing is a structural systemic codependence of planes within the same website or among websites. And we are doing that, in effect, with the publication of our data from Urkesh. Let's say that you have a ceiling as a fragment like the ones you saw before. Well, on one plane, you have a description of the object itself, which, as you scroll down, which I cannot do here, but you have a whole series of information which is constructed from different people at different times, but it ends up providing really a sequential narrative, just like an argument. So in this case, this is a detail. Every single observation is dated and initialed so that the responsibility and the quality of the observations can be calibrated. And so you have what we call a staccato kind of narrative, where different pieces are really glued together to form a narrative that you can, in fact, transpose into normal prose. This is for the description of the city, but at the same time you have another plane on stratigraphy, to which the A track, the one about ceiling, refers. But if you open then the stratigraphy, in this case the description of the feature within which it has been found, you find the full description of the setting. The arrow points to the specific point where this ceiling was found. Typology. You have another plane, in this case it's in fact even a different website, where there is a fuller description in a more standard sequence. It's not a staccato, I call it legato, using the musical metaphors. It's a normal sequential narrative that in turn, of course, has hyperlinks. But these hyperlinks are really always systemic and integrated, not anecdotal and informational, as we said before. Or yet another one, chronology, where there is because the seal helps us to date something, and if you look at the level or at the phase to which it belongs, it explains everything else. So this is the systemic, the kind of epistemic system that we are proposing, where it's a system of interplanarity instead of non-linearity, which is the standard way of looking at information. We really have an interplanarity where the planes are tightly interlaced with each other. As a curiosity, this is a machine that was built, well, never built, but it was designed by this engineer, military engineer in 1588. He designed almost 200 things like this, which were never constructed. But it's a book wheel. You see, as you turn, you have different books that refer to the different planes. So in our case, you say one that speaks about the shirt, one about the placement, the typology, and so on. So all of this is feasible in a website in a totally integrated fashion. Obviously, the Ramelli thing is the best they could do. It was in a way, it's what we do when we do critical thinking. We read something and we don't have the wheel, but we have the library, we have our shelves, we get one book, we have one idea, we check it against something else. So in a sense, our mind works in an interplanar fashion. But what the website can do is that it does that of its own. It anticipates and it helps you to do even better. So instead of having less internet, we should have more internet, but more in the sense that not of quantity, of quality. It should be this kind of approach to a website. The reason why archaeology is particularly useful for constructing something like this, as we have done, are doing with the website, and that's what the Balzan Prize allows us to complete, is that we have these myriads of information, literally millions. So the sherds at Merlin study, we have collected and registered about 1 million in the 25 years of excavation. Only 300,000 have been fully analyzed, but 300,000. And they all fit into a scheme like this one, where the chronology, in this case, you have these 1,000 years in the levels above the palace. So each one of these refers to a specific point, sends you back to a specific point. And ultimately, it helps us really give meaning to a quantity of data. So the end result is not only that we see something reconstructed and understood, like the palace, but we have a system, an epistemic system, that is something that embodies all of this in a very novel way. Novel, but I mean not just because it's novel, because it's better, because it really gives you a different quality of development of a website. Okay, so a little late, but thank you.
So now I'd like to invite both of you up to the microphone, and we have time, a bit of time for questions. Does anyone have a question? Please.
Marilyn, I noticed that one of the posters was in Turkish. Do you have Turkish helpers there, or any
We have Arabic and Kurdish, but not Turkish.
Okay. And then
Many people don't come across the border. It's not so easy to come across the border, especially nowadays. So the local population would speak and read and write Arabic and Kurdish.
And in Kurdish, how is that written?
Well, in Syria, it's written in a different way than it's written in Iraq. In Iraq, it's written with the Western script, but in Syria, it is written with the Arabic script.
Thank you.
It's one of the problems between Syria. There's Kurds in Syria and the Kurds in Iraq, unfortunately.
Yes, please.
It looked like you, in the course of your work, you had to take arable land away from the village. How did that go over?
Very well. In a way, more important than the arable land, the cemeteries. We have 4 cemeteries on the site. Because the site is not arable, and so they were putting the cemeteries there before our excavations, and there were 4, belonging to 4 different villages. The excavations came close to one of these, and at that point we had to remove. Some of them were very recent. In fact, you could almost still see the decomposed body. But, see, what is it? We had always had an approach to human remains in the excavations from very ancient times that was very respectful. So instead of just putting the bones in plastic bags, which is what we do with the animal bones, we would put them in a wooden box, which was like a coffin, with linen or cotton cloth inside. So there was a sense of respect from the beginning. This gave the local people the sense that we were respectful for the past, also for past human remains, and they went along with us. There was no problem at all. So we had a ceremony where we transferred them to a different location. That for that. Arable land, the same thing. That doesn't depend on us, it depends on the government. There is just like, well, in Europe especially, there are strict regulations on antiquities areas. So the area does not allow for construction. It allows only for the outer city. It allows only for for agriculture. One person, when they wanted to build something, so he asked us, and we, upon mandate of the government, as it were, of the Department of Antiquities, we excavated the area. We concluded that yes, it was still, in fact, ancient. There was ancient material. He was part of the people who was working with us, and he was the first one to agree that we should not, that he should not construct anything there. That's the beauty of being able to, Marilyn was talking about the Socratic approach, Mayavics. We really feel that we have brought out a child. that these people are really identified with their past to the point that they are able to make sacrifices. One last thing. It's not only the site, but it's the area around that we wanted to protect, saving it from high rises, from hotels even. At some point, tourism would call for that. So that's why we established that park zone, 54 square kilometers. One reason for having the lectures in the villages was to convey the sense that even though we were not there, we were still very much involved in the local area, and we wanted at some point to bring this park to make it into a reality, and we would then be able to produce the kind of tourism, enlightened tourism, that would give them, on an individual, not owners of big hotels, but individual houses with bed and breakfast kind of lodgings in the villages, the returns. It's very difficult to make a case like that during a wartime when vandalism in other places is the quickest way of making very little money, because who makes money is not the people who dig it, but then people who sell it. So, but we were able, there was no problem. There is nobody who would even dream of getting a piece out of the site, but even around it, now there is a great deal of respect for this landscape. That's our point. It's not only the site, but it's a landscape.
I want to add a footnote, and that man who was not able to construct this because we had found all of these, we actually found a lot of seal impressions in an administrative building. Was extremely interesting. And we never would have excavated out there in the outer city because we were so busy excavating on the high mound. Anyway, we dedicated the book, which the digital book, which contained all of these materials that we excavated on this land. We dedicated it to him with a very big picture on the title page of him. So he's now much more famous than if he hadn't.
In the back first, and then here. Yeah, please.
So I understand you have two projects going. One is the archaeological dig, and then the other one is all these projects with the children and the art exhibits, right? So it's kind of two parallel projects going on. The dig continues. The research continues.
You have two parallel projects going on, one the excavation and then the education aspect.
Yeah, that's for sure. And now the education is the emphasis because we can't excavate there. I mean, it's too dangerous to go there.
So the locals are not excavating right now?
Oh, no, they would never go there without us.
And so how do you, I'm just wondering from a leadership point of view, how you have to inspire people to continue. This has been going on for 12 years, so how do you, I know you use Zoom, you do all sorts of things.
How do you inspire people to continue even though you're so far away?
We're not that far away, you see. I mean, we talk to them all the time. We see them, on Zoom. We give little lectures to them. We're not that far away, actually.
In fact, a footnote too, the picture that she showed, one of the pictures in the village, sitting on the floor, on the screen, there was actually a short video with the two of us welcoming them in our poor Arabic, telling them precisely how much we cared for them even though we were not there. This kind of human contact means a great deal, and it works.
Please.
Yeah, going back to the archaeological aspects, as you go through the various archaeological layers of time, do you see any evidence of conflicts over the site and whether or not it's changed the direction that the site was going in through time as you go through this as a result of conflicts within the area?
Evidence of
conflicts within the area.
Conflict, you mean with other sites or
With various groups.
of war, evidence of war? No,
previously.
we didn't in our case, but not because there wasn't. I'm sure there was plenty of war. It just so happens that the palace was abandoned because they built another one some other place. The temple instead continued to be used, so we don't have evidence of war, but there's plenty of evidence at other sites.
And the letter that Kara mentioned at the beginning showed that the king of Mari was trying to control this area. He had conquered it, but was trying to control this area and administratively, and it was almost impossible for him to organize it because the people at Urkesh were against him.
You had a question?
Yeah, I'm curious about the burying of those people. Did it include a religious ritual when they moved from another place? And when they came to...
You mean like the Acadians coming in, or?
No, in modern time.
Oh, in modern?
You remove some of the tombs.
Oh, yeah.
Did it involve a religious ritual?
Okay, so the question is whether in modern times, removing, for instance, the tombs entails a rituals, local rituals. No, there was no ritual at all, other than just common sense respect. So we were there all together. There all together mean the excavators and the local people. We removed the individual burials, and individually we reburied them in another area. That was it. Yeah.
Yes, please, there, and then
Language, or what writing system did you say the inscriptions were in?
What language is the writing system?
What language and what writing system?
Right. Well, the writing is cuneiform, which is the one introduced by the Sumerians, it appears, as far as we know now. But cuneiform was then used. There's sort of two ways of conceiving cuneiform. One is that not only the wedges, which make the cuneiform sign, but also the sign. So in one case, the same sign is used in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in Hurrian, in Hittite, but it's read differently. A bit like the heart, which you can say like love or j'aime or whatever. But then the same wedges could also be used in a completely different way, and that's the case of Ugaritic, where they are used to indicate alphabetic characters. Okay? So the way that I told you, the administrative tablet is written in Hurrian, I said. It's actually written in Sumerian, but with morphological endings in Hurrian. So it would be like saying that you say, he, heart, es, her. He loves her. The es tells you that heart is a logogram that is read in English. If instead you would have, let's say, a, then we say el, ama, ella, whatever it is in Spanish. Okay. So that's how it is. The language, and that's how we can tell that the language is Hurrian, because even though some of the signs are still logographically Sumerian, they were read as Hurrian.
That's why California license plates are so interesting to look at.
I'm just curious to go back to this business of excavation. Suppose the war goes on another 10 years, another 20 years. Are there people that will, still pursue this, take it over the project?
Us?
Okay. Another 40 years.
No,
What's the hierarchy?
It works this way, that the permits are given to an institution, and by the Department of Antiquities, which is the one in Damascus. And so unless there is a total change, like if Turkey invades and takes over, then we would not respond to it. We wouldn't even go back. But as long as it is there, we respond to the Department of Antiquities. We as institution, which is not UCLA in this case, it's actually a different institution. There is an international institute that combines also other universities. So the permit is that one. Then the permit holder, that is the institute, together with the Department of Antiquities, appoint a director. So Marilyn was the director until actually the end of the excavations of the war, and then in the meantime, we have appointed a new director, who happens to be our son, actually, but our son is a full archaeologist in his own right in Hurrian. So he's actually the director. But the point is that it's a permit holder that guarantees a continuity.
And there's a breadth of people that are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Many institutions.
I wanted to retire from fighting all of those local battles, financial support, etc., etc. So I said, give it to somebody else. If I go back, or when I go back, I should say, I'm going to sit there and work on the ceramics and the seal impressions very quietly.
Yes?
So UCLA has a pretty large collection of cuneiform tablets. I don't suppose any of them bear on your site, or I would just be interested in your comments about UCLA's holding of
You mean tablets, clay tablets?
Yeah.
So if there are...
Any in the large holdings of cuneiforms at UCLA, partially in special collections, and the Coates Institute. So we have so many of these ancient tablets. I was curious if you...
Well, there are a few here, which I had seen a long time ago, and they're mostly from the Ur-3 period, so from about 2000, 100, 2000 BC. But there was a small collection. Are you in charge of
I used to be head of special collections.
But there were very few. I think
but Lloyd Coatson gave some more to UCLA.
Okay. No, that I was not aware.
Oh,
I thought they were also working on a project where they were digitizing.
That's the cuneiform digital
Oh,
library initiative.
but that's much more than you should. I mean, it's all...
And it's since moved to Oxford.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was not aware of Lloyd giving, a very cute story though about Lloyd. Lloyd Coatson is one who was a good friend of ours, and we did a survey in the Syrian steppe with him. In fact, for a month, we traveled around the Syrian steppe. But anyway, the story is this. We were his guests in Beverly Hills, and he was in a sort of pre-archaeological mode, so he was buying antiquities, and he said, I have a tablet here that I just bought. And so he shows me the tablet, and I could read it. It's very difficult because unless it's from a certain period with which you're familiar, you can't read. It's like epigraphy, paleography with codices. But fortunately, I could read that because it was for the period I knew. And so I could read the name and the date. It was dated because it was a small tablet, administrative, from a certain site near Nippur, where I had worked. Again, another guy said, I just bought a tablet. So he goes out, he was a neighbor, he comes back with another tablet. It was the same name of the same person from a similar date. It was, just not the same day, but a few years apart. So it was the most uncanny moment when in Beverly Hills, these two tablets, which had been written at the same time within a matter of a few years, 4,000 years ago, because it dated to about 2030 BC, came together again.
You might have started Lloyd Coatson on the collecting of cuneiforms.
No, on the non-collecting.
Yes?
Did you see any evidence of climate, the difference in climate between, say, 3,500, 4,000 BCE and like 1,000? Is that
evidence of climate change?
Yeah, climate, because of the agriculture, etc.
Right. It's actually a big issue in the because there is a claim that around 2,200 there is a great moment of drought, and that was the reason for the ending of the Akkadian Empire. And there are some sites that show that ours does not. Ours continue. There is a decline of the empire and also of our city. The city contracts a little later, but it contracts. But there is really no specific evidence of climate change from our side.
Our site seemed to have been abandoned slowly. And when the Assyrians, so our site is a Hurrian site, that's the population. So a major Hurrian god, Kumarbi, lives there, probably in that temple that we excavated. But when the Assyrians came, you know, this Hurrian practices were anathema, as Giorgio showed you. You know, you never would call up the deities of the netherworld to help you out in any way. And so the Assyrians did not do anything to the site, but they also did not encourage people to stay there. So slowly the site is abandoned, and then people forgot about our friend Kumarbi.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a practical question, but when you go on digs, you're probably there for months at a time, right? Where do you stay, in a village? How do you have internet? How does that work?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, because we have a perfect answer. See, it depends on who you mean by you. Most archaeologists do, in fact, go and live in tents or villages, which we did at the very beginning. But then we decided that we really wanted to have a more permanent presence at the site. So we built the best excavation house in Syria by far. It has 40 rooms, bedrooms and labs. We set up a very good labs for conservation, in particular, of objects. Then we were also the first.
A swimming pool too.
Well,
Excuse me.
no.
We needed to laugh.
No, technically it was a water reservoir. As long as we have to build the water reservoir, I said, let's make it in the shape of a pool. And so we were able to go swimming. But the point is, though, that we really wanted not to just go and leave. We wanted to embed our research there. And so we stayed generally about 3 months. And 1 year, the whole year, there are 3 people who stayed for also in the winter. So we really wanted to be a research center where people could do it. We had a good library. It was pre-digital, so we had microfiche. We had brought, but then of course we had the digital library, which allows you really to do top research. We didn't have the internet yet. The internet came in 2011, so in the year between. But we had a LAN, a local area network system, that was set up in 2003, so that all the computers in the house were linked with the local server. It was just local, but it was essentially the same as internet, except that instead of worldwide, it was Urkesh-wide.
Kara, how does the experience of the Buccellati compare with your work in Egypt?
My work lately has been all in Cairo, which means I get an apartment, I stick the grad students in there, we figure it out, we eat at restaurants. It's as urban as you can possibly imagine. And even if I'm working in Luxor, same thing. I'm always living in a city of some kind when I'm doing my archaeology. And so much of my work is museum-based. I was just with Elysée de Villiers, it was at the back, we were just at the Met. And I stayed at my brother's in Upper East, so I was fine. My archaeology it's very bougie. So, yeah, I'm not much of a dig house person. The longest I've done is 4 months at the Lish dig house with the Met expedition at the pyramid site of Dashur. So that was pretty good. It's pretty good. I had to wake up the dig director in the middle of the night to get a mouse in my bed. And Dieter Arnold, he even got it. Yeah, it was really sweet. That's the most drama.
Never happened to us.
No, jumping desert mice. Oh, sorry. Thank you all for coming, and thank you.